process has several steps. The first step that we talked about was invention. Invention is a nice name for pre-writing. And if you remember, pre-writing starts with simply thinking. It doesn't start with brainstorming or actually writing things on the paper. It simply starts with thinking about your topics and ideas. Okay. With our pre-writing, we remember that there are different types of brainstorms that we can do to make sure that we have an idea that will fit our page amount, that has a particular purpose in mind, that we consider our audience and focus. And sometimes things are created based on an occasion. So once we think about last week when we had Labor Day off, we could have wrote a paper about the importance of Labor Day and how people fought for that to be a holiday and what that means to actually labor. Different people have different ideas of labor and hard work. So we could have wrote something about that. Also, we discussed the purposes. Remember, when we are writing, we have different types of purposes. We can combine all three, use simply one, have two, a wide array of things that we can incorporate. So remember, one is expressive, all types of emotions, happiness, sadness, whatever emotion you want those people to feel. Informative, simply giving them information. And then persuasive, trying to convince your audience of something. Now, once we started our pre-writing, one thing to note is we simply have a subject. Our first upcoming paper is a narrative. And that's a subject, a very broad subject, narrative. So our goal is to get from a general topic to a very specific topic. And so what we do is think about different ways that we want to talk about narratives. And so with this, one thing that we did, if you see here, is listing. Of course, there are tons and tons of different types of brainstorms. We could have did the clustering. Of course, we could have done the questioning. You see that at the bottom. We did the listing. We could have done the looping. We could have done free writing. There are a wide range of different types of brainstorming. And next week, we will actually start to complete some of these while we're in class. And next week, when we start to talk about our literacy, one thing that I will do is let you look at the topics. And as a class, we can decide if those topics are okay or if we want to change those topics. I am perfectly okay with that. I don't want you to feel constricted. I've noticed when your topics are chosen for you, you don't tend to write as well. So I'm hoping if you guys choose your topics that you will write to the best of your ability and choose things that you're actually interested in writing. With the listing, you see here, we chose social media. We started talking about social media and how Siri actually stalks us and listens to us. We talked about having followers, likes. We talked about Snapchat. We talked about all the different things. And so from that, we got different ideas about what social media is, different ways we could use social media, maybe different essays we could have written, and how to persuade people to do promos and use Facebook for likes and digital marketing. We could have probably wrote an expressive essay that talks about how much we either hate or love Facebook and the fact that it stalks us when we are using our Safari and Chrome. So we could have done that. We see the questioning here, as I said, you ask different questions to figure out what exactly you want to discuss. Just like when you ask a ton of questions when something's going on, you can do the same thing for your essay to figure it out. Alright, the next step in our writing process that we discussed dealt with our thesis. Once we kind of figured out our topic that we wanted to write about, we started to think about our thesis. What kind of argument are we going to present about this topic? So remember, our thesis is two parts. I like to call it a golden thesis. It is our topic plus our opinion. But remember, there are different types of opinions. We want something that we can have different points of view on. If you are writing and I ask you your opinion on tattoos and you simply say, I think tattoos are stupid, I'm pretty sure many of us in this room who have tattoos will probably say, we think you're stupid, So we'll have a combative back and forth. And so one thing about our thesis, it doesn't have those opinions with those negative concepts or unnecessarily emotional connections. So if I ask you about tattoos and we want to have an actual discussion about them, you can say that tattoos can hinder people from getting a job depending on the location. And so we can have a whole different debate about that. You can say, well, if they're on your face, people may have these different concepts and you're probably less likely to get hired. While if they're on, your arm and you cover it up with sleeves, they don't notice it unless, you have short sleeves or something on. Then people have a different thoughts about you, etc. So think about your thesis and how you present those arguments. Another thing is, a lot of times when people give us a thesis, they like to give us facts. That's not a thesis either. When you are creating a thesis, it should have your opinion, not just facts. If it's something that's a true fact, it's not an opinion. If we can sit here and say George Washington was the first president, everyone's going to say that's a fact. And guess what? That cannot be your thesis. Now, if you want to say, you want to talk about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Madison, and they all came from the state of Virginia, and that they were part of the Constitution, of developing the Constitution, and that they had this paradoxical concept of what is freedom because they all own slaves, then that's something we can argue. Because some of you may say, no, that type of freedom is different, okay? And then we can have different arguments on like the impact of slavery, all of that. So we can think about how we present these arguments when we are considering our thesis and our topic. Another thing, a thesis is not a title, okay? It does supposed to command attention. However, as I said, it needs an opinion. Another thing about a thesis that we need to make sure we don't include is, I've noticed this and people do this a lot, and we're going to work on this, but if you start off like this in your drafts, it's fine. It's just when we get to the final paper that we make sure we get rid of some of these issues. In this paper, I will address blah, 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 or I believe this. If you write that in your thesis, then that's unnecessary. So use time, we can cut that out. But if you feel okay with writing it at first and then going back when we are getting to our drafts and our revising, that's fine. Okay. So as I said, your thesis does a couple things. It clearly expresses your main idea. Okay. It's going to tell your purpose, and it is clearly worded. We don't want anything that seems confusing because we need our audience to follow everything that we are saying. Okay. And we also talked about an implied thesis. There's one where we don't put one directly in our introduction. We tend to use implied thesis, especially in our narratives, because we're going to tell a story, and based on the story, we're going to figure out what a person thinks. And this is just another example of questioning that we did last week. Here we go. We get to arrangement. Section that we talked about is arrangement. It talks about how we set up our essay. And so remember, there are different ways you can set up your essay, especially for your narrative. Your narrative is a story. So if we're thinking about stories, we can think about movies. We can think about books and how they all start in different ways. Of course, we can have one that says once upon a time, and it does this nice chronological order. If that's the way you want to tell your story, that is perfectly fine. But if you want to start somewhere in the middle or near the end and make a loop and come back, we can do that. That's called pivotal point. We can do one that's completely spatial, where something that may be currently happening, but we're not talking about it as in chronological time. So if you've ever been to an event, let's say like a parade, and you start to describe those things, you may start with the people next to you, the smells that you see, the smells that you are inhaling, the food that you see, and then you start to go around in a circle. Okay, that's spatial. You're looking at it in that aspect. Okay, we can do third person, where it's like you're telling a story from the outside, or you can insert yourself and have it in first person and you interact with people. So third person, a perfect example is Three Little Pigs. This person says the first little pig did this, the second little pig did that. So that person's not actually in the story, but they're telling what's happening in the story. Another thing with arrangement is, once we figure out pretty much what we want to write about, we figured out kind of how we want to write it, we can do outlines. Outlines are a great thing. We can do all types of outlines. Outlines are actually very, very helpful depending on the type of essay that we are writing. For our narrative, I don't think I require one, but I know once we get to our compare and contrast, and our cause and effect. I do, simply because those are a little bit harder to write and the arrangements are a little bit different. And so I'll make sure that we create some for that. But when we are creating our outlines, remember there are three major parts. We have our introduction, our body, and then our conclusion. And so you can think about your lead in, how you're going to capture that person's attention. There are tons and tons of ways to capture attention without it being a rhetorical question. If you're going to ask a question, make sure it's a question that's not a simple yes or no. Make sure that it's something that makes people think. Okay? A lot of times we use questions, but it's a simple question. So make sure that it's a deeper question. Of course, you can use stories, jokes, facts, statistics, all of that to bring attention to your story in that. And then, of course, with your body paragraphs, we talked about that. And the main purpose for your body paragraphs is for you to include your evidence or your information, such as examples, reasons, analysis, facts, experiences. All of that comes into play in your body paragraphs. And then, of course, in the end, you have a conclusion. Depending on what type of essay you're writing, it depends on what you put in that conclusion. If you wrote a essay that's about like rhetorical analysis, of course you'll reiterate your thesis, things like that, but your narrative, you won't have to repeat your thesis. So it really depends on the type of essay for that. Okay, and this is just an example of an outline.